So the next thing we went over was we started with formulas. So you should be very comfortable with formulas, especially with the basic ones, and especially using the equal sign. Okay, so for this course, you're not expected to know like complex physics formulas and math formulas. If I do want you to calculate something, I'll just tell you the formula. The formula is calculated in this way. For example, the compound interest, I would tell you compound interest is calculated with initial investment multiplied by blah, 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 blah. Okay, and you would just have to take that equation and implement it in Excel. So do be expected to be able to implement a formula that is given to you, okay, using the equal sign. Okay, you can either type in the data, or you can use, or you can click on the cell itself, so referring to A1 or B3 in your calculations. Remember that things do follow orders of operation, so if you need to force something, for example, if you want to do addition before multiplication, that you do need to use parentheses. Okay, understand what a form is. A form is something that's set up to let a user enter the data, so it's not that you enter the data, it's the user that enters the data. So you leave the blanks, you set up the formula, and when the user fills in the blanks, then the formula will output something. Okay, so we've made various forms. One we set up for an employee where we had a bunch of blanks where they could enter their sales, and once they enter their sales, their commission was automatically calculated for them. Okay, and so in a form, these would be blank, ready for the employee to enter them. We also made a form with the compound interest where somebody could enter their initial investment, the interest rate that they get, and the number of years they want to invest in, and it would output their final amount. Okay, so do be familiar with that. And then we went into the built-in functions. The most basic ones you're definitely expected to know: average, sum, count, counta, or count A, or whatever, however it's called. You are expected to know how to use the if statement, possibly multiple ifs, nested ifs. I don't remember what we call it. So ifs inside ifs. So sometimes when you're testing not just for 2 things, but for like 3 things, and possibly more. Sometimes when we're doing more than one possibility, that gets into lookup tables. So you can look up what you want in a whole bunch of possibilities and then return accordingly. Okay. So here are some of the more common basic ones, and then we talked about various others. Sometimes you might have to lock a cell. So if you recall, when we autocomplete a formula, Excel just kind of bumps the cell reference down. So at first, if it was using A3 in the formula, when you autocomplete, it'll use A4 and then A5 and then A6. And sometimes you don't want that. If you don't want that, then you need to lock the cell. So know that. Okay, the if function, the 3 parts, and then if you have an if statement inside an if, then you might have to replace one of these parts with another if statement. Okay, so we had various examples that you can probably go through. I think a lot of these examples are videos now on Moodle, so you can go back and watch those videos if you need to review those. Okay, we went to a lot of examples: time, text. This was a very complex example. I probably wouldn't expect something from like this from you, but more importantly, this was an example to show you how some problems are solved with multiple steps, and you may need to be able to do something like that. So taking something you need to solve, dividing it into multiple steps, have like intermediate columns. So have a column that's going to be an intermediate where you're going to do a little thing and then use that to further your calculation. Okay, we did text functions, concatenating lower, taking the left part of something and then putting all those together. So that's not another example of a multi-step problem when we created a username, right? We had to do basically three things. We had to take the first letter, we had to concatenate, we had to use the lower, and we saw that we did those all in separate columns using intermediate steps and then finally put them all together. Or you can use functions inside functions. So we use the concatenate inside the lower function, and then etc. etc. Okay, so you can review all those examples. Same with logic and lookup using and, or, right? We use the example, you can pass the course if you have a good grade and good attendance. And we also did an example, you can pass the grade if this or that, things like that. So logic, Boolean logic, I think it's called, using and or. More examples using if statement. Okay. There is some ifs that's available in some versions of Excel, but since not all versions of Excel have that, I won't be using it in this course or in the exam. Okay, but it is something rather useful in the more recent versions of Excel if in the future you have multiple possibilities. Okay, charts. Using data, how to manipulate your data, organize your data in a way that it can be put in a chart. So you should be able to do that. Sometimes there's just a lot of information and you have to kind of pick and choose which information is appropriate to put into a chart. Sometimes it's about how to fit things into two axes. I have to choose certain variables that I want to answer some sort of question. Okay. And then formatting charts. So once you do make a chart, once you do create a chart, there are various things that you can format. You can format the various axes. You can change the type of chart. We had some examples where we had some data. We played around with various types of charts. You can change colors. You can put data labels. You can put axis titles. You can change the title itself. You should always have a title. I've said that many times, but do remember that. Layouts, for example, pie charts, often by default, I don't think they're displayed as percentages, and a rule of thumb is do have your pie charts display percentages, so you can definitely change that with design and layout. Okay, so yeah, formatting, starting with a question, and many examples of that. Moving on to pivot tables. Pivot tables is a very quick way to organize your data. Often we had to organize data before putting into a chart or focusing on something. So pivot tables will take a lot of information and be able to focus on something. Okay. Do remember that it does require some sort of repetition. So for example, if I have sales of different people, so Lawrence sold this, Lawrence also sold this, Lawrence also sold that, etc., etc., and you can group all that together. So here are all the sales of Lawrence, etc. Okay, so very good for very complex, long, detailed data. Here you can see the repetition, lots of sales in the east, lots of sales in the west, and then north, south, different types of clothing. Okay. And the various parts of pivot tables, moving them into rows, columns, and filter, and the values. Often by default, the values is a sum. Sometimes it's a count, depending on which variables you've dragged into the pivot table. So the various options of formatting and whatnot involved in a pivot table. So that should be pretty fresh in your mind right now. And again, there's all those videos on on Moodle that you can review. Okay. What if analysis, often useful when you're talking about hypothetical situations. We talked about using goal seek, so be sure to understand that. Again, look at the video on goal seek. And the other what if that we talked about was the what if scenario, so creating multiple hypothetical scenarios that you can kind of compare side to side, and it's often useful to name your cells so that when you generate that summary, it actually shows what you're talking about instead of just saying A4 and B6 and you can't really tell what they are. Okay. And PowerPoint, there's no PowerPoint on the exam, so I won't include that in the review. Okay, so like I said, if you have anything that you want me to review specifically, please ask in one of the forums and I'll either respond or make a short video depending on the situation.